So, good morning, everyone. Very warm welcome to this session on creating space of engagement, policy, justice, and the practical craft of deliberative democracy with Sarah Wiebe. Before I do this, let me just, first of all, acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen people on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, the Squam, and the Salish peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. And Sarah will give us, I think, with her engagement and her work with Indigenous communities, a good sense of what this respect could look like, also in terms of the research that we're doing, how we engage with communities, and what appropriate ways of engaging with our Indigenous communities here on the land can and should look like. So I'm really pleased to, in a way, also have Sarah's presentation speak to an ongoing challenge for us as academics to think creatively about reconciliation in a university context and what a proper relationship with the stewards of this lands actually mean on the ground. With this, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Sarah Wiebe to our community here. I feel she has never really left because she is very much part of the UVic community. She grew up, as you can see here, on Coast Salish territory, and she went away for a 3-year stint in Hawaii. Before returning very recently in 2020, we just discussed her return to Victoria, some of the logistical challenges in the age of COVID to doing this. We are very pleased to have Sarah back because she brings to UVic a wealth of experience in issues that are close to the hearts of most of us around this virtual table, but I think the Center for Global Studies and UVic more broadly to think creatively about the intersection between issues of environmental justice, democracy, citizenship engagement, in responding to critical challenges that we face at this time, the environmental, ecological crisis, issues of justice, of proper governance. And Sarah has done this in a variety of ways of approaching this. Community-based and engaged scholarship, partly also thinking about new ways of conveying and approaching knowledge through filmmaking. You can see here that she's been collaborating also on this front with different media, how to engage communities. Filming is one, and she has worked also with, let me check my notes here, she is the co-director of the Seascape Indigenous Storytelling Studio. So all those are examples of her trying to creatively think about how knowledge can be generated in close collaboration with communities, but also how we can then project this out and tell the stories and present your research findings. So, and also on a personal note, Sarah, I think we've been collaborating for ages now. I had the great pleasure of hiring Sarah at the MA level, I think it was, or was it beginning of PhD in a research project. So it's so great to see Sarah thriving through the years and now having a position at UVic as an assistant professor in public administration. So Sarah, belated congratulations on your new position at UVic, and welcome back to our community. And with this, I would like to give you the floor to present your research. And you very generously stepped into an open spot we had. So we thought, one way of re-engaging you is to hear about, also you've done a lot of recent work, you've published a new edited book that you can see here on the slide. So I'm sure there's much that you can enlighten us with and talk about in terms of your current research. So Sarah, the floor is all yours.
Especially thank you to Oliver for such a kind welcome. I'm really delighted to be here, home in Victoria on unceded Coast Salish territory, and to share with you a bit about this book that I'm really excited to have recently published, Creating Spaces of Engagement. And you can see the title on the slide here, Policy, Justice, and the Practical Craft of Deliberative Democracy. which was a labor of love and a project that Dr. Leah Levac and I have been working on for a number of years now, over 5 years. And I'm really delighted that Leah is able to tune in and join us today. So she may be able to chime into the conversation as well. And I was so thrilled that she agreed when I reached out to her and asked if she would work on this project with me. And as I'll explain in a moment, this project has origins here on the west coast of Canada. So there's, with any project, a long sort of journey that has unfolded. And thanks for listening and being part of hearing about this journey today. So as Oliver mentioned, I'm a new professor in the School of Public Administration, but I do have a pretty long connection to the University of Victoria, as I completed my undergraduate and master's in political science, and was certainly somebody who benefited from the mentorship of Oliver Schmidtke, who was one of my mentors during that period of time. And then I ended up relocating over to Ontario, where I did my PhD in political science. So I have a map here on the screen just to kind of give you a sense of who I am and the kinds of questions and interests and themes that speak to me, as I really saw this as an opportunity to sort of reintroduce myself to the global studies community and connect with all of you and hear about some of the great work that you're doing as well. So as I mentioned, I did my bachelor's and master's here at the University of Victoria, and I'm originally from the Salish Sea, so from the Vancouver area. And then I relocated over to Ontario, specifically Algonquin territory, where I did my PhD at the University of Ottawa. But then I always tell people that I equally learned from the academy as from community. So I did sort of 2 years of my studies while living in Ottawa, and then sort of moved over to Sarnia, Ontario, which is in Algonquin, is Anishinaabe territory, and worked on my PhD project, which turned into a book, which I have the cover of here, called Everyday Exposure, Indigenous Mobilization and Environmental Justice in Canada's Chemical Valley. This book really sparked my interest in public engagement, and it planted a seed, I think, which was nurtured later when I returned to UVic as a postdoc and subsequently reached out to Leah and said, there's not a lot of sort of in-depth critical literature that looks at public engagement and that sort of examines public engagement processes, and but also kind of imagines how these processes can be more just. And so we started brainstorming and reaching out to colleagues and put together this collection, which we really hope will be useful as a teaching tool. And now that I'm teaching in public admin, I'm already excited to incorporate this text into a few classes that look at community development, for instance. So just in brief, some of the critiques that I developed out of the work in Chemical Valley was really around identifying how a specific deliberative process, a public health study, failed. And so my book is unfortunately very critical of this health study process for lack of meaningful engagement, for an overemphasis on lifestyle blame of the community rather than looking at the socioeconomic conditions, for confusion around jurisdictional responsibility for funding a health study, and for some limitations to the sort of epidemiological model of public health. There was always this issue of the community that's experiencing these environmental health harms most acutely being a small sample size. So for those of you who may not be familiar with this area, where I was living at this time in Sarnia, Ontario, there's an Indigenous reserve, which is 7 kilometers south of the city, and it's completely surrounded by an area known as Canada's Chemical Valley, which is the densest concentration of petrochemical and polymer refining. And they have a lot of concerns around reproductive health and cardiovascular health, respiratory health, among other ailments. And then, perhaps one of the least studied issues as well around mental health. And so over the years, this community has really advocated for a health study, a really robust health study that looks at their unique needs and concerns. But there's been a real lack of engagement from different levels of government. So my book sort of tracks these policy challenges and these challenges getting health study funded. So that's, work that I completed in 2016, and then right around that time, I reached out to Leah, and actually there was a conference at UVic. It was called QVic 2014, I believe, which was an international conference, and myself and a colleague, Crystal Tremblay, facilitated an Arts of Engagement workshop, and it really got me thinking about the different ways in which researchers can creatively and imaginatively work with communities to address complex problems. And so after that workshop, I started really taking an interest in kind of art-based approaches to research and trying to incorporate them more and more into my own research practice, and then working with Leah to kind of document and reflect that in this project. So here I want to provide just a little overview. So in the introduction of the book, we've titled it "Why Create Spaces of Engagement? Connecting Theory, Policy, and Practice." So here we talk about the importance of theory. And so both Leah and myself are political scientists, and we've read a lot about deliberative democracy and political theory. But as I mentioned, we really wanted to see something quite applied. And I found that I was often teaching public admin courses and public policy courses, and not quite sure which textbooks or literatures to bring to anchor some of these concepts in practice. So that's really one of the main goals of this text, is to connect theory and practice and provide a useful teaching tool for educators in the classroom. And again, being political scientists, we start by acknowledging the lack of neutrality of these spaces of public engagement. And I was really inspired by the work of Genevieve Fuji-Johnson, who's a political theorist at Simon Fraser University. And she's written a book called The Democratic Illusion. So she writes, really critically about the political nature and the highly charged atmosphere of these spaces of engagement. And so we start off the introduction acknowledging that, these public engagement spaces are highly fraught, and we draw upon a range of cases and examples from pipeline debates and issues around, hearings, the formal context of a public hearing, but how that lacks sort of meaningful listening and context. So the chapters that follow draw upon public engagement case studies, and we tend to steer away from the case study terminology, but look more at sites of inquiry or vignettes, and really try to raise and address some of these questions about justice and why create public engagement, and advocate for what we call a policy justice approach. And so I'll explain to you a bit about what this policy justice lens means to us and how we think it's relevant to the theory and sort of framing of public policy and engagement, and then how we think it can be kind of useful in practice as well, in order to work towards the social and environmental justice aims that we have as scholars. So we sort of take our cue from deliberative democracy theory and then really kind of anchor it in specific engagement processes. So as I have here, we argue that policy justice requires innovation and imagination, and many of the chapters talk about the role of the arts in this respect to do so. So these were some of the driving questions that informed our work together. And I think the first one is really, in my mind, the critical question that we had animating this whole project, and one I still have to this day. It's an unanswered question, but I think a really important one to reflect on. So what does meaningful public engagement in policymaking processes look like? So what does it actually mean to engage citizens in ways that aren't just, paying lip service or doing ad hoc checkbox kind of consultation, but actually involve citizens who are affected meaningfully in the process? We also acknowledge that there's a growing need for public buy-in, and the term that's often used is social license for these processes to run smoothly, but then how do we define the public? And several of the chapters in the book caution about overgeneralizing how we frame the public or how we frame community, for instance. And the third question here, how can our understanding of the public be expanded to not just include, but be led or driven by diverse communities, diverse experiences, and include the voices of those who have been marginalized from conventional democratic processes? And finally, what does this expansion of the public mean for policies and development, but for how we also think about and conceptualize policy? I want to just offer a few slides here with these graphics that show a few sites of inspiration for myself in particular, as we think about the different kind of spectrum of engagement. So the question I had on the previous slide began with meaningful engagement. And I want to highlight here that there's a range of ways in which decision makers are charged with reaching out to communities to potentially gather information or share information, or moving along the spectrum here to the right, empower communities. And so inform would be the lightest form of consultation, so just sort of passing information to an affected body, whereas empowerment would be, giving the decision-making authority to a community group. And I think we see less examples of the empowerment side of the spectrum than we do for inform. And many of the cases that we document and examine in this book are somewhere between the kind of consult and collaborate spectrum. And so this image here actually is from the Office of Community University Engagement at UVic, and sort of takes that spectrum and applies it to the field of community engaged research. So again, many of the scholars in the collection are using community engaged research methods to work with communities who are conventionally hard to reach, whether that's working with recycling binner cooperatives in Brazil, or Filipino migrant workers in Canada, or in my example, Indigenous youth in Attawapiskat. And so these are some of the principles at the top here that have informed how some of us think about doing community engaged research. So these four elements certainly have influenced how I think about doing community engagement. So certainly trying to build partnerships, co-creating some of the research questions and interests, designing the project together, involving communities in the process, and then sharing the sort of responsibility for knowledge dissemination at the end. So involving communities through all stages of your research process. And I think this does somewhat mirror a spectrum of engagement as well, when trying to think about how do you not just inform communities of problems, or not just sort of consult communities in your research, but work with them and co-create knowledge together. So you can see here again on the spectrum, sort of a low charge of engagement towards a higher form of engagement. So as I mentioned, most of the contributions in this collection are towards the later end, between involve and collaborate. So policy justice. In this book, we define this as a commitment to advancing public policy with very explicit anti-oppressive and social justice aims, including the engagement of affected communities in public administration and public policy processes from the early stages of design through to decision making. So again, this is very different than kind of just formal, check the box, what I've often called science fair consultation with a poster board and a comment box in the corner, but really trying to work with communities to co-create the framing of problems and then the framing of solutions. So here's an image from one of my favorite chapters in the book, chapter 9, which is authored by Joanna Ashworth. And she talks about artful forms of engagement and works with various community groups in Vancouver through artistic methods to visualize their ideas for healthy and sustainable futures. And so that's one thing I want to add here, is that I really see policy justice as a futures-oriented framework, one that not just identifies challenges, but really tries to imagine and envision sort of worlds beyond our existing status quo forms of violence and oppression. So some of the core elements of policy justice really build up from including diverse ways of being and knowing through different forms and phases of public engagement. So the three phases we talk about here are the framing of issues, so including communities and how problems are defined at the very beginning. I think that's a really important aspect to this work. Second, developing policies and also developing your process together is really important. And this term development, it does collapse a lot of different phases, but this is kind of the general sort of phase that would describe how you define your work together. And then the implementation. So not just, leaving communities behind after you've engaged them in your process, but actually working together to design and define some of the outcomes that you envision for healthy and sustainable communities into the future. So in brief, we define policy justice as a social and environmental justice oriented approach, one that aims to be anti-oppressive and academically draws from three main bodies of literature. So we discuss intersectionality, and I've also been very inspired by the work of a scholar named Elena Hankivsky, who's also based at Simon Fraser University and has developed with her team there the framework of intersectionality-based policy analysis, which similarly has very social justice-oriented aims. Critical theory, we spoke a bit earlier about democratic or deliberative democracy in theory and practice and how that informs this work. And then interpretive scholarship, looking at processes of meaning making and acknowledging that communities, will have multiple ways of defining themselves in relation to process and in relation to outcomes. So who's our audience for this work? We have sort of, I guess, three main audiences in mind. First of all, being academics, I started this project thinking I would love to have material to teach in the classroom. And so the sort of interdisciplinary fields that we had in mind included public policy, public administration, community development, and political science. But second, we're really hopeful that this book can speak beyond the academy and be relevant to practitioners. So civil servants who might work at the City of Vancouver or City of Victoria or at different levels of government, we're hopeful that they could read these chapters and find some useful tools and insights to help them with their process and their practice. We also believe that this book would be useful to the nonprofit sector. So looking at not just the government sector, but also kind of the non-governmental sector as well. And several of the chapters do engage with fields of critical community development studies. And I'm thinking of our colleague Astrid Vanessa's work looking at foreign aid development in Nicaragua, for example. So there are some really great examples of how this work can be relevant, not only in a local Canadian context, but globally as well. And you'll see I have a few images that I've gathered from a website called participedia.net, which I highly recommend to any of you who are interested in looking a little bit more deeply at various cases and sites of public engagement. So that's a project online ran by Mark Warren, who's a political theorist at the University of British Columbia. And he has many examples of these public engagement sites. And one of them, the Grandview Woodland Citizen Assembly, is taken up by our author and colleague Rachel Magnuson in creating spaces of engagement. So there are three main parts to this book. So the first part is the most theoretical. So this we've entitled Across Disciplines and Beyond the Academy, Stretching Deliberative Democratic Theory. So as I mentioned to you, we were very inspired by various scholars of democratic theory, including Jürgen Habermas, but also Iris Marion Young, Chantal Mouffe, and others who have helped influence our thinking around deliberative democracy. So the chapters in this section kind of challenge and push back and apply these ideas to very specific examples. And one of them is the Grandview Woodlands Citizens Assembly that I mentioned. The second part goes a little more in depth into practice and centers the voices of those who have been marginalized from these deliberative processes and evaluates these processes to say, how can we engage communities more? And this is where the art-based methods start to come in, and various scholars draw upon different tools, whether it's art or mobile galleries or photography, to work with communities to document their concerns as well as their solutions and strategies. The third part, effective and affective spaces of deliberation, goes even further to look at perhaps non-conventional spaces of engagement, really going into communities, trying to hear from communities, whether it's Northern Ontario or into Brazil or overseas in Nicaragua, and looking at different, not just kind of smooth, rational, deliberative spaces, but these emotional, highly charged spaces of engagement as well, and then offering some lessons for deliberative democracy. So I have some highlights from each of these sections that I wanted to share here. And my apologies for collapsing many of these rich chapters into these sections. There are 16 chapters overall, and I wouldn't have enough time, unfortunately, to go through all of them today, but we'll offer some highlights. So in part one, I want to just explain briefly, what do we mean when we're talking about deliberative democratic theory? So some of the principles associated with this approach include participatory inclusion, procedural equality, access to information, respectful exchanges of reasons. So often this approach is known to really look at sort of the quality of debate and discussion and dialogue and try to work towards a kind of consensus. So it's really a theoretical approach that tries to move away from being hierarchical and top-down to being much more horizontal and deliberative with citizens and decision makers. Many of these chapters also highlight the importance of framing and noting that problems can arise when public officials are the ones defining problems. So these chapters highlight why framing is relevant and can really shape and affect the entire process. And then again, some of these chapters ask to evoke some caution about how community is defined and discussed, and really try to respect the diversity of community spaces, identities, and forms of belonging. So the second part of the book gets into these more artful methods. And here we have an image, again, by Joanna Ashworth, documenting some of the ways in which she has collaborated with communities to showcase and highlight what participation means to these communities. So she's even reflecting on the process and definition of these terms through her research. So specifically, these chapters bring forward a range of public engagement processes and tools. And most of these chapters speak to how to engage traditionally marginalized communities, ranging from women and girls with disabilities in Vietnam to lower income communities around Vancouver, to working with Indigenous communities and also working with Indigenous women. So these chapters emphasize arts-based engagement and storytelling. So storytelling is a theme and a thread and a concept that starts to come out in some of these chapters. And the importance of storytelling is highlighted for us as being much more of a relational approach to research and engagement than an extractive one. And that tension is really, really important for us. And then the third section, which is where my chapter and several others appear, where, again, we're trying to sort of move beyond these traditional spaces of engagement, so beyond parliament and legislature and city hall, beyond neighborhood associations even, and into kind of community organized spaces, and trying to work with communities to understand their visions of healthy, sustainable, socially just futures. And I just love this image. This is an image I took from National Geographic because I think it speaks to the themes of one of the chapters by a friend and colleague, Dr. Bruno Olivier Jaime, where he's working with binners in Brazil and showing kind of their everyday practices of engagement and identity and belonging and visions for sustainable futures. So I thought I would just take a moment and hopefully not too much of our time together this morning, just to share with you a bit about this project that I've been working on for a number of years now with youth in Attawapiskat. And actually, while I was a postdoc at UVic back in 2014, I was fortunate to be awarded a SSHRC Insight Development Grant to work with young people in the community to reframe the media's representation of Attawapiskat. And so the title of this project is More Than a Crisis, Treaty Relations in Attawapiskat. And so I was really, first of all, taken by the way in which former Chief Teresa Spence engaged in what was framed as a hunger strike to raise awareness about treaty relations and the lack of Canadians' understanding of treaty relations in the community. So I started working with her and reached out to Teresa, and she said, would you please work with the youth? That would be sort of a meaningful way for you to do the work that you want to do with the community. And I was quite nervous because I'm not, or certainly at the time, was not an expert in youth-based engagement, but was eventually successful applying for this grant and then building a team of Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists who organized a series of critical media workshops in the community. So we started by looking at sort of mainstream media and mainstream representations of Attawapiskat, and then working with the youth to sort of counter those stories with their voices. And if you have time later to go to the website, you can see their digital stories and some of their images there. The website is www.reimaginingattawapiskat.com. And here there's two images of two youth leaders that we worked closely with in this project. Jack Linklater Jr., who ended up taking a position on his chief in council and is a really inspiring youth leader. And then also Keisha Rose Paul Martin as well, who's another really inspiring youth leader. So there's three main components of mixed media storytelling that our team developed. And then we published about this in the Journal of Environmental Media, if you're interested in further reading about it. So this relates to, first of all, an interrogation of predominant portrayals. So really starting to challenge and push back on and interrogate and question the predominant framing of communities like Attawapiskat as always troubled, vulnerable, and crisis. And certainly this is a community that has experienced sort of a pattern and repetition of what I've called elsewhere sort of these everyday emergency situations due to state of emergency declarations that are repetitive. But we really wanted to highlight that is not the only way to represent this community. The project is really about critiquing colonialism, critiquing crisis, but also celebrating community and celebrating culture. So the first part is that kind of critical interrogation aspect. Then the second is dialogue. So working with those who are portrayed or directly affected by those portrayals to start to identify some sort of counter portraits or counter portrayals. And the third, which is definitely ongoing and still a challenge as we try to figure out how best to do this, is how do you then work with those counter stories and those counter narratives to speak back and intervene on those mainstream representations? So we have a website where there's a collection of these stories and these narratives, and I've been at conferences with Keisha where she's shared her story, and each of the youth have traveled to share their messages. But I really wonder, what does it mean for policymakers to listen to their stories and listen to their voices? And so that's where I think sort of deliberative democracy in theory and practice and public engagement needs to push further to think about not just sort of hearing, but also listening, and how does that listening inform policy, and how can their voices, for instance, influence policies around mental health and health generally, and environmental issues that they're experiencing and their concern as well. So this approach really advocates for having the representation of diverse forms of leadership, including youth leadership and youth voices in these processes. So each of the cases in the book offer some lessons for deliberative democracy. So in my chapter, I talk about the importance of building relationships and how this takes time. And again, not just approaching communities when you already have your formulated plan or ideas or solutions or outcomes, but really trying to work with communities throughout all stages of your, whether it's a research project process or some sort of public engagement process, but investing that time and energy into that relationship. Trying to support multiple voices and forms of storytelling. So this mixed media approach used a range of tools from photography to poetry to music to short form storytelling to photo essays. And similarly, I think it's really important to acknowledge that different communities are going to want to express themselves in different ways. And so trying to be responsive to that as a researcher or as a practitioner is really important. And then related to relationship building is that sometimes these relationships may continue and may not just end with a project. So being really clear with your collaborators about that is also really essential to this work. And then further, reflexivity. So this is, I think, a really important point for us in the academy to think about, is not just approaching communities as places of problems to solve, but really as places of learning and spaces of learning, acknowledging that we learn with and from community. So as I kind of move towards the conclusion of my talk here, I want to highlight some reflections and contributions and sort of key takeaway messages. So in the book overall, we talk about how careful inter and transdisciplinary theory and practice of public engagement is necessary to include and to think about how to include, and also to think carefully about how to be led by communities in all stages of the public engagement and policy development process. And this is essential to working towards social and environmental justice aims. We also want to highlight that the processes and practices and outcomes are heavily context dependent. So none of our suggestions here can be overly generalizable. And it's really important to think carefully about what communities' aims and desires and sort of areas of expertise are when you're working closely with communities. And again, I want to return to this point that in order to work towards more socially and environmentally just outcomes, this is, I think, most achievable when communities are involved throughout all stages. So the framing, development, and implementation of a policy process. And again, policy justice as a concept and a framework depends on the inclusion of diverse people, knowledge systems, and forms of evidence in policy creation. So the term evidence is important here because quite frequently in public admin circles, as I'm increasingly becoming familiar with, evidence tends to look at data and generalizable trends and sample sizes and surveys, and that is very important and necessary rich data, but so are people's stories, their life histories, their context-specific experiences of living with particular concerns. And so widening out how we think about evidence is crucial as well. So the three core concepts that I hope that everyone can take away from today include policy justice, which I've been speaking at length about, deliberative democracy, noting that this is a rich and robust field of study, but would benefit from some broader application and practice. And the third concept is radical policy futures, which comes up in one of the chapters authored by Alana Katapan and her collaborators. And I really love this term because it speaks to that futures-oriented approach to policy that we're trying to imagine here with community, what radically, healthier, sustainable, more environmentally just communities would look like. So I wanted to just offer a few thoughts about why I think this work is relevant to the global studies community. And so I have just two examples here. So one, this is a shoreline in Hawaii, a place that I've come to know intimately over the past few years as I lived there, and have been part of a team that's looking at issues around sea level rise, for instance. And sea level rise is very much in your face and a felt reality there. And policymakers are trying to figure out how to administer managed retreat in a socially and environmentally just way. So there's a lot of people that live right at this coastline, and it raises questions about what do policymakers do in terms of building seawalls or not building seawalls, or offering incentives to relocate and that sort of thing. So these are very complicated issues that affect the global community. So sea level rise is obviously an issue related to climate change and a global phenomenon, and requires collaborative and imaginative thought beyond Canada to Hawaii and elsewhere. The other example here is Puerto Rico, and this image speaks to me as I'm working with Astrid Vanessa, who's been a fellow of the Center for Global Studies, and we're looking at, again, social and environmental justice critiques and responses to looking at debt and emergency relief in Puerto Rico. And so what I want to emphasize here is that there's a range of sites around the world where public engagement happens, and there's, I think, a great need to look locally and globally as well, and think about sites of collaboration, solidarity building, how international law and policy affect communities in kind of overlapping ways often. I think that policy justice presents an opportunity to address some of these complex and multi-layered issues that are often very multi-jurisdictional. Certainly, sea level rise is an issue that touches on a range of legislative and policy frameworks at local and global scales. And these complex issues like climate change as well certainly transcend the conventional levers and levels of government and governance as well, if we're thinking about other non-governmental organizations and agencies. So finally, collaboration and multi-sector engagement are essential for policy justice here in Victoria and also around the world. So with that, I will move to my concluding questions here. And I also have my contact information available on the left-hand side if anyone's interested in furthering these discussions and conversations. But I have just a couple questions that you're welcome to respond to, or I'd love to hear from you about any examples that come to mind in your work and your experience of public engagement, where you've seen processes work smoothly, where you've seen them work in complicated, fraught ways. What lessons can we learn from these cases to sort of improve the social and environmental justice context for community wellness and well-being in the places that we care about and that we're working with. So thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was fabulous. Thank you for opening the window or door into your very rich research. And I'm so glad that we recorded this session, because that was also one of the reasons why we invited you, because the issues that you speak to, the challenges that you encountered in doing community focused work, speaks to what we collectively share in terms of how the questions: how do we design our research, how do we do justice to working with communities respectfully, and in also new innovative ways of dealing with the knowledge that we receive through them. So I'm very thankful that you could really share your experience. I can definitely see why public admin want to hire you, because it's really something that is at the cutting edge of research in a way to rethink also traditional ways of knowledge and the role that universities play in relating to the subject of their research and how they interact with them and how knowledge is being generated and distributed. Sarah, if you could stop sharing your screen, then I would like to invite people to, if they want, come up with their questions. You gave us, that's very clever at the end of your presentation. You present us with questions, but Maeva, you just, I think, I said, or I'm not sure whether you want to come in or you just, okay, Maeva, start us off, please.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Wow, this is fascinating work. And I really want to connect with you at some point, because I think you were at my presentation last fall. So yeah, I really love the arts-based tool to engage youth. And I find, like, in a policy setting, like at the UN Climate Change Conference, for example, I noticed that for Inuit youth that are really shy to speak, typically, arts and using videos is such a great way, because they can share their voices without filters, almost, to like one of the biggest influencers of negotiating climate change in Canada. What I find difficult is, and it's interesting to the policy justice lens, because I haven't really read about that, so I'm interested in learning more about that. But how can we ensure that these people are so busy, and yeah, they listen to the youth voices in like big settings like that, but how can we ensure there's actually follow-ups, and like how is it responded to, and that? I don't know if you could speak up a little bit more towards that, because it's a difficult part to measure impact of those voices on politicians, right? And how is this going to make an impact in the long term on policies?
Should I go ahead and respond now? Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying about different kind of tones and temperaments in communities. And actually, you mentioned kind of shyness. And when I went to Attawapiskat, I'd been there about 4 times for different lengths of time. And I came with, my workshop materials prepared and expected to do kind of large group discussion and had a certain sort of vision in mind that just completely didn't work because of this sort of shyness. Nobody would talk in large group settings. And so I was invited to work mainly in the high school art classroom. And so the art teacher just said, Sarah, you can't work like that. Basically, you have to kind of sit with a student one-on-one, get to know them, and kind of build up a rapport that way. So I had to work much more slowly, I think, than I'm accustomed to. So that was a cultural challenge for me, trying to, figure out how to balance people's comfort with public speaking and their interests. So that's how I kind of built a rapport with some of the young people, like looking at their phones and the images they'd already gathered, for instance, documenting sunsets and the northern lights and the beauty in the landscape where they live and the food that they would eat and that would bring them joy and things like that. So yeah, I sort of share that experience with you, trying to understand that not everyone's going to want to work the way that you think they're going to want to work, and welcome you that way. And I know that, so one of the main concerns in Attawapiskat with respect to the youth over the years has been the 2016 state of emergency declaration due to the escalation of suicide attempts. And so that happened right between a couple of visits there. So I had visited in February 2016, and then the state of emergency happened. And then I had plans to return in June. So I went back in June, and that's when I found out that I was successful with the SSHRC Insight Development Grant, right when I was, in the community. And I was trying to think about, how does that state of emergency, how does it affect this project? Because this project was sort of conceptualized before that happened, but obviously this is an ongoing issue. And it was interesting to see the way in which different policymakers responded. And so some of the youth leaders, they went to Ottawa, they met with Trudeau and other officials. And so there was some meaningful space for discussion and engagement, but it was sort of a one-off event. And so that's where I really wonder, how can you have ongoing, iterative, continuous discussion and dialogue? Unfortunately, I would say that Ottawa and Toronto, if we're looking at the sort of centers of policy with respect to Attawapiskat, have not been very relational in terms of their approach with Attawapiskat leadership in general. And I'm sort of writing a separate book about this, looking at Teresa Spence's Fast, but I think it raises a bigger question for policy officials. Yeah, how do we as academics encourage policymakers to rethink their forms of engagement and include youth voices, include women's voices and diverse voices? Perhaps that task is up to us to sort of elevate the importance of that based on our research, based on our work, because it doesn't seem to be happening in practice very well. I know there was a mental health forum that took place a few years ago that was led by Indigenous youth, and their vision was policymakers in the back, not talking, just listening. So I think that's kind of a neat model, kind of structuring the design itself such that the youth kind of have the floor and the policymakers are there observing and listening. So I think that might be one helpful example.
You have to create like arts-based persistence, maybe like the persistence factor, right? To push for more response and two-way communication, maybe. And yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you.
I can definitely see how making policymakers listen rather than talk, is a major challenge. But more seriously, Rebecca, good to see you. Please, you could come in.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for this presentation. I really appreciate you sharing about your new book. I've read parts of your everyday exposure book, and I definitely cite it in my PhD that I will be defending next month. And I think my question is about the link between the two. So the link between the diagnosis of injustice that you do in your first book and a more positive approach to solutions brought by communities, by engagement of policymakers with communities. And how do you do this link in an optimistic way, right? Without not just being completely overwhelmed by the issues that you have diagnosed before of injustice. And second, the idea of policymakers listening to storytelling. So how do you recommend us to have this buy-in of policymakers to the stories, right? Because they're busy people. They want your straightforward recommendations. They very rarely want to sit in a room and listen to storytelling, and they want the link made for them, right? So how do you recommend us to do that? And thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate the way you phrased the everyday exposure work as a diagnostic, because I look back so critically at that book now, because I don't feel like there's a lot of hope in that book. It really, at the time, I was very influenced by Foucauldian notions of biopolitics and governmentality, and just couldn't see a way out of this assemblage, this kind of toxic assemblage with respect to policy, with respect to the toxins in the environment. And I was often really trying to find these glimmers of hope and these moments kind of beyond the current context. And I think that the youth do offer a lot of hope, and that's probably why I've ended up turning to work with youth in different ways. So in the Everyday Exposure book, I don't talk about really the sort of photo voice or the participatory video work that I ended up doing, which was it wasn't directly related to my PhD at the time. It was kind of more of an aside. I built relationships in community by working for another professor as her assistant, and we were doing photo voice workshops to kind of build relationships and rapport. And then at the very end of my PhD work, right when I was kind of done all of my interviews and I'd finished my sort of 1 year of living there, which is the time I gave myself, and then a youth leader approached me and said, "Oh, would you work on this project?" He said to me at the time, he was in grade 12 at his high school, and there was no content about Anishinaabe culture. And so he said, "Would you help me do a presentation for the entire school about our culture?" He's like, "I know you've been in the archives and you're such a nerd and you have all this material. Could you help me do this?" I thought, okay, at the very least I can help him with this presentation. And we started meeting with different leaders in the community, and we decided, I don't really remember how we decided it. We're like, let's make a film. So we ended up making this film called Indian Givers that was on YouTube for about 10 years. And we just recently got taken down actually because it had some music that wasn't copyrighted. But this film was shown in the high school, and it was something that I used to teach in the classroom. And I think it was a really, well, it also had that kind of diagnostic feel to it, because it had interviews between the youth and people living in Chemical Valley. And the final scene of the film was always really hopeful for me. And I guess I can give it away now since the film's not online anymore, but the youth are dressed in their regalia and they're walking down the halls. And it's kind of this moment of reclamation and resurgence. It's very powerful, but it's not really dialogical in the sense of there's no agreement or reconciliation or resolution. It's this moment of observing the kind of strength of the youth. So I feel like that tone, that kind of lack of reconciliation, is a tone that you feel in Everyday Exposure. It's a tone that you feel in the film. It's a real tone as well, because reconciliation is so fraught and ongoing. So yeah, that's a different tone than this next book, as you've highlighted, with respect to creating spaces of engagement. And I'm not sure if Leah is able to chime in. I know that she's been able to join us today and talk about any of her experiences or examples, but I think I felt personally that I had this responsibility as a researcher to think about solutions and to not just diagnose and kind of walk away and then assume, oh, I've done a good job of detailing this problem, but not really thinking beyond it. And so I guess that was maybe a personal feeling or decision that I had, where I felt like I can't just sort of walk away and never think about this again and never think about the policy links. And a few years ago, I was invited by the Ministry of Ontario, actually, their Indigenous Affairs Ministry, to do a presentation. So to policymakers specifically about Chemical Valley. I thought, oh, good, this is an opportunity then to at least share the research with them. And by this time, I had, thought a lot about what's happening in Chemical Valley. I had already been well into the process of working on this book with Leah. And so I was able to talk about policy justice. So I was able to sort of apply policy justice to Chemical Valley for a policy audience. And I was really excited. I thought, oh, good, this is a moment of connection and then listening to stories. And I had, video clips from elders and others, but there was dead silence after the talk. And so that I was so, I don't know, I was very shocked by that. Perhaps I shouldn't have been shocked, but I think part of it is that it's heavy. And if you're hearing, the tones of chemical sirens going off and then elders talking about their pain, but their hope, it's maybe challenging to some people who are accustomed to a different work environment. So I think perhaps it was that those in the room needed just to sit with the material and the stories for a moment. But at first I thought, wow, people don't really know what to say or what to do with it. So you raised a really good question about listening. So certainly people were listening, but I don't really know exactly how to evaluate the impact or measure, how my presentation or the material would have affected their policy kind of process or decision making. So yeah, I think I have perhaps an inconclusive answer to you to say that, we've just worked through this framework. We've just published this book. We're just starting to talk about it. So maybe that's, again, the onus on policy, not just policy officials, but researchers to share our visions or strategies for how this can be useful in practice. I see Leah with her video available. So I wonder if I can ask Leah if you want to add any thoughts about that, anything I've shared. And thank you for being here. I know that you're busy with a lot of other, pressures right now. So just, yeah, thanks for being here and thanks for being such a great colleague.
Let me echo this. Welcome, Leah. Do you want to come in?
Sure. I just, if that's okay with folks and we have time, let me start by apologizing for my decidedly unprofessional attire. I'm at home on parental leave, so I have a baby asleep on my lap, and this is about as dressed as I get these days. So anyway, it's really nice to be here, and of course, Sarah, nice as usual to hear you talk about this work. I think it's so interesting, just as an aside, that although we worked so closely together throughout all of this, it's always really interesting, for me at least, to hear Sarah talking about it, because we each add our own sort of little emphasis in terms of the things that we noticed or emphasized and so on. So I enjoyed listening to that presentation as well. So my name is Leah Levac, and I'm on faculty at the University of Guelph, which is the traditional territory of the Aamjiwnaang people and the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I also have the pleasure of collaborating with the Haisla Nation and the District of Kitimat in northwestern British Columbia in some of my work. And then on the opposite coast in Labrador, in the homelands of the Inuit and the Innu people. And so we do work on Northern women's conceptualizations of well-being in a context of resource extraction and the way that affects their preferences for policy decisions and also their sort of strategies for engagement. So I was just thinking, just in response to this last sort of discussion, the reason I wanted to chime in was just to say that one of the pieces that we're working on right now that might be of some, maybe another way of thinking about this is that we've started trying to think about how we can be actively involved in delivering training type experiences to the public officials with whom we're collaborating or with whom we're trying to sort of bring along to the policy justice party in some cases. So in the District of Kitimat, that process, after we had done a couple of years of data collection and sort of collaborative focus groups and sharing circles, talking about women's conceptualizations of well-being in that context, we developed and delivered a training to the District of Kitimat staff about different ways that women were experiencing or not experiencing well-being in that environment. And now that has translated into, it's still sort of pending, so I want to be a little bit tentative about it, but it is hopefully translating into some work where we will, with a community advisory group, start to actually look at some of the policies, some of the local policies together, using sort of an anti-oppressive, justice-oriented lens to try and feed back some of the ways that a lack of policy justice or experiences of systemic discrimination get built into or baked into policies at the local level. So one of the so we started with a community engaged approach to research, and now we're sort of working on through an advisory committee process, trying to figure out how to translate that work into impacting different sites of challenge really within the community. And this is one of those sites. So that's that comes to mind. So this idea of thinking about how to work with policy makers across governments to really think through, well, what does it mean to create more just policy? What does it mean to listen to communities? How do we accidentally, or maybe not so accidentally, I prefer to think it's accidental, it makes it easier to work through, you know, how do we overcome these systemic and structural challenges? And maybe just one other thing I'll say on this, also on this training note, is that another way that we've become involved through that work is to have become quite actively involved in the new federal impact assessment legislation, in terms of working with the federal government, both with the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada and now with Health Canada, on trying to develop and bring together materials and translate them into sort of relevant information for policymakers who are trying to, in this case, incorporate intersectional considerations into impact assessment as per the legislative requirement now. But there is, I think it's fair to say, a real lack of understanding about how that could actually happen in practice. So what does it actually mean to follow those parameters that are now dictated in the legislation? And so again, here there's sort of something of a training flavor to this approach as a way to try and build relationships, but also start to sort of share some ideas about practices that could be more inclusive and could lean more heavily on some of the principles that we're trying to sort of assert and advance through this book.
Thank you very much, Leah, for sharing this. You know, it's most insightful. Thank you. Nicole, did you have a question, or just switched on your screen?
Before I ask my question, did anybody want to follow up on what Leah just said? I don't want to crowd the floor of somebody else. Okay. Okay, so thank you so much, Sarah. I'm Nicole. I'm doing a PhD in political science with Oliver, and I'm looking at discourse and narrative around the intersections between climate change and human mobility. So I'm interested in your Hawaii sea level rise retreat, but I have a couple of kind of comments and questions, and I guess in my own work, I'm also looking at the connection between narrative and discourse and the policy implications of certain framing. And I'm wondering if in the Reimagining Attawapiskat, and sorry, this comes back to kind of the impact, but the degree to which the community engaged approach and kind of privileging the youth's voices have managed to change the media. You know, if it was imagined as a reaction to the brutal media depiction of what was going on, to what degree has that shifted, or are you able to show that it has shifted? And that kind of connects to this other thought or comment I don't really know about telling the right story, right? So what stories are we telling? Who's the we? Who are they about? You know, there's all sorts of kind of complications there, because in my own case, I'm kind of looking at the intersections at a much more abstract level. So I'm not working specifically with the community, although I have looked at displaced communities in BC from floods and wildfires. But in terms of like, what is the right story and how to kind of control that narrative. And then just one last kind of comment around this idea of radical policy futures. So I really like this idea, but I also am feeling a bit conflicted about radical, because I feel like radical has the connotations that feminism did, you know, in the 90s, right? Where it's like, oh, you're a feminist, oh, that's scary. And radical kind of carries that same weight, when actually, if we think of radical policy futures of being more inclusive and more just, there is nothing radical about that, right? Like that is a reasonable policy future. And the degree to which we label those things radical, I think makes some policymakers uneasy. And sorry, just one other thing I wanted to say about the stories and policymakers. So in this project that we did last year with PICS on climate displacement in BC, what we heard from people in the BC government who are working on the adaptation plan is they need stories. They understand that they need stories to motivate or inspire change. And so they were looking for, you know, how do we tell this? How do we talk about climate change in a really narrative or in a way that people can relate to and can empathize with, and it resonates. And so I think in different places, there is a real reception to this kind of work, but I think it also depends on who the policymakers are. So thank you so much for your work. It's very interesting, and I would love to have a longer chat later. I don't know if there's a specific question that you want to tackle there.
No, that's great. As you were talking, I thought, oh, I can't wait to see you present about all of your research. That sounds incredible. So yeah, you mentioned a range of terms actually. So discourse analysis, framing, narrative, storytelling, and I realize sometimes perhaps I use these not intentionally, but interchangeably. And I think they're really distinct in many respects. And when I think of discourse analysis, I think of Foucault and other scholars who have kind of laid out this methodology of critique. So looking at language and the power that language carries to kind of shape norms and habits and practices. And then when I think of framing, I kind of think of framing as related to discourse, but perhaps more relevant to sort of media analysis or policy analysis, and kind of looking at the sort of like targeting of images. I'm currently looking for resources on feminist framing approaches. So if you have any insights on that, we should swap ideas. So I'll just maybe explain the connection with the Attawapiskat work to this other manuscript that I'm working on. So I actually was successful with a SSHRC postdoc fellowship just before starting the Reimagining Attawapiskat project. And so that project is looking at the media's representation of Teresa Spence's hunger strike. And so it was framed as a hunger strike, but when I interviewed her, she was pretty clear saying, you know, this, it's a fast, it's different than a hunger. So it was interesting, even just the terminology. So framing for me is kind of about different perspectives. And so, yeah, I'm trying to sort of look at the framing of her hunger strike and how it has been framed by the media, by public officials, by Canadians. So in a lot of my kind of background and document analysis work, I put in some keyword terms, Attawapiskat and Treaty 9, and have been trying to look at how the community's been framed over time. And then how that framing historically is different than the framing that Teresa herself would offer or the youth would offer, for instance. And so in the mixed media storytelling method that we're articulating through this Reimagining Attawapiskat project, you're right to point out that there's this question about how, I guess, how do we measure the impact of the reframing or the I guess what's the evidence or examples of it? And I'm also wondering myself, how can their stories influence policy, or how can it shape representations? And I know many Indigenous journalists are actually calling for different forms of storytelling that don't just paint pictures of communities as in crisis or vulnerable, but co-author stories or elevate youth voices in telling their own stories. So I think careful kind of reflection about, again, who's telling stories and how is really important to that sort of counter storytelling. In the manuscript that I'm writing now, which is tentatively entitled Life Against a State of Emergency, I talk about this framing, and then I'm trying to develop this sort of the metaphor of a kaleidoscope as a lens to look at sort of framing and reframing. And the main kind of orientation of this metaphorical approach is more, breaking apart hegemonic narratives and trying to kind of reshape and reframe them with a multiplicity of voices and narratives. So I really see it as kind of like an ethic of decentering, kind of decentering the hegemonic normative approach, so that, maybe I'll have a chance to share about this work another time and not take up too much space here, but the sort of three main narratives that tended to frame Teresa Spence's hunger strike was crisis. So this is a troubled community, but then also sort of a blame the victim. So blaming her lack of sort of fiscal responsibility. And then the third discourse being kind of accountability. And at the time, a conservative government and others saying, she's not a good leader. So really kind of this unfortunate, the sort of patriarchal patronizing blame the victim prompt, rather than looking at the other discourse of treaty relations, which is what was driving her hunger strike. So I guess I see framing as trying to look at different perspectives of representations. And I think that for me is inspired by critical discourse analysis. And then I see the storytelling as the kind of perhaps more radical or optimistic part that is trying to speak back to those hegemonic narratives. And then you raise a good question about kind of the rhetorical purchase of radical and how it can be useful, or is the term radical policy futures, is that going to resonate with policymakers? Is it going to scare them or startle them? I quite like it given my orientation as a critical thinker, but you raise a good question. Would I put that in a briefing note to a policymaker? I don't know if I would necessarily, without some really careful definitions or explanation of why it's not so radical or why it's easy to implement. So I haven't actually thought perhaps about the practice of that term enough. And so you remind me that it's a worthwhile undertaking to give it some careful reflection. So I hope that you can read the chapter that talks about radical policy futures, and then perhaps that might bring out some insights on how you think about that term. It might be useful. And I'm certainly curious to hear more about your climate change work and the power of storytelling in that work also at a future time.
Thank you.
Let's go on, Tamara. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, so much. It's so exciting to hear about your research and to hear about your work with story. My background is in working in participatory video. That's my PhD focus, especially on in the area of climate change and the SDGs. And I had a quick reflection on working in that space, and then kind of linking that into a question. What I've seen just in the past 10 years, really, in the UN and civil society, is that there's a lot more advocating for inclusive voices, especially in the area of climate change and the SDGs. But I think a lot of those, I have two observations about how those calls, have shifted practice into actually influencing change. I think the first one that you see is that there's a lot of calls for different voices, Indigenous voices, young people with disabilities, people on the move, refugees. And a lot of the funding tends to focus on the representation itself and also the celebration that we've now heard from someone whose voice is not heard. And that gets really promoted and becomes a commodity of the organization in a way of, and then they use it in a certain way, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the power is shifting for the people who are sharing those voices in the situations that are keeping those voices unheard. That said, I've also seen some really good examples coming from organizations who are developing more, even really in-depth consultative processes and collaborative processes with refugee youth and disaster impacted youth, where they have a topic and they have a policy that has a call for civic engagement, and they are creating processes to bring young people into that, but with this outcome of we want this. So there's actually a call from the people who are doing a lot of the advocacy, or even the policymakers themselves, who understand what young people with disabilities might be thinking. So I'm really excited about that space and a lot of the changes that I'm seeing. I'm working with UNICEF now, so seeing a lot of the documentation and the focus on working not only for youth, but with youth. So my question is in writing proposals, I think that it was brought up here that it's so important in the design to not just focus on the representation. And I think even in action research processes, the funding is often on the representation, not on those opportunities to actually continue working with the people you're working with or in the partnerships, so that when you're coming into a community, you're not working with individual youth, you're working with an organization that will continue working with them to create networks and do other things that actually help to shift their agency and shift their voice for the long term. So with that in mind, what recommendations do you have in those kind of shifts for academics in writing proposals that can that start with policy in some cases, or a collaboration between the two? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your reflections. And yeah, I look forward similarly to learning more about your participatory video work in those diverse fields. That sounds incredible. And I'm encouraged by what others have said as well, that I think there is an increasing sort of welcomeness to storytelling and policy. So it's good to know that there is this space that's kind of, it's just maybe a smaller space, but growing. And so I'm hopeful that, we can engage our work in this space. With respect to grant writing, you raised good questions as well, because whether it's a PhD project or a postdoc project, or a grant that you're working on, I think often, in my experience anyway, I've proposed to do a specific project with like an end date, but not necessarily thinking about the longevity of the project or what comes after the project. And I think perhaps that's something for us to reflect on as community engaged researchers, is that kind of ongoing relationship and commitment and desire to work with the community and to follow up. I think perhaps one of the strategies is to identify partnerships. So I think, increasingly, as I do more work in this field, in this area, to try to think about maybe partnering with nonprofit organizations or other organizations who maybe have existing relationships and existing experience, bridging between communities and policymakers, and maybe working with communities to develop those channels of communication. I think that's a role that we can play as academics, is a bridge and convening spaces. And it can be something simple like hosting a webinar that includes community members, includes policymakers, includes academics, or conferences, and really trying to bring a diversity of voices to these more kind of public forums, so that there is this opportunity for exchange of ideas and knowledge. In terms of the the longevity. I think that raises some really good questions. When I think about what's happening in Chemical Valley, unfortunately, I don't feel, I wish I felt more optimistic, but I have a hard time feeling optimistic about it because so many researchers like myself have come and they've done their work and then they've moved on. There's, eco-justice has come and done work and moved on. There's a lot of this kind of like coming in, doing a project and leaving. And so it raises that really important question of sustainability of relationships. And so how can you continue to work with a community organization over time? And I think it's a really important question for us to think about as academics, is that relationship building, not for just the purpose of doing a project, but what does it mean to ethically exit a community, and what are the expectations from the community? Some communities might not really want to continue a relationship. They might feel like, okay, our work's done together and we need to carry on with our normal agenda of tasks on our sort of daily project list. But others might say, I liked working with you and I'd like to continue. So I think it will really vary. I sort of feel like in an ideal setting, because I'm not in Ontario anymore, I'd love to be able to connect the communities with other researchers who are closer by, who might have resources that could continue some of that work. Like if the community, I'm thinking of Aamjiwnaang, for example, if they still want to do a health study, connecting them with community engaged health researchers that can facilitate that. I'd love to be a part of it, but maybe not drive it, but still kind of be involved. So I think you're right. I think when we're applying for grants and when we're kind of committing to work with communities, we can't forget about the what comes after part. We might not have the answers to that right away, but at least thinking about that early is really important. And I know from when I worked on the documentary film with youth, we didn't think about the after part very well at all. And that was kind of a failure that I reflect on, because at the time we just thought, let's make a movie. And then we made it. And then we're like, oh, who owns this movie? And then what happened? And all of these questions started coming up, and who goes to conferences and festivals and speaks on behalf of it? And it just, our sort of crew fell apart because we hadn't thought about it, is what, happened. And, one positive outcome is that the leader of the project is now in film school and he's going to redo the film, and that's great, because I think we learned from this experience, we collaborated, and it sort of fell apart at the end as projects do, but out of that came something else beautiful, and I'll be really excited to see what he comes up with on kind of his own terms, with a more kind of Indigenous youth focus rather than a sort of more collaborative project. So I don't know if I answered your question very well, but I want to acknowledge the questions that you're raising as really genuine ones that we do need to be thinking about more seriously.
Thanks, that was great.
Thank you, Sarah. And I greatly appreciate, it's, even just opening these questions and these conundrums that we sometimes face when doing this research in your tradition that you described well, right? So I think we could use another hour to go now into issues of deliberate democracy and good governance, but yeah, I think we have to wrap things up. But Sarah, it seems, you're working on another book, so hopefully we will have you back, soonish, and hear about your ongoing research. And as you could tell from the reaction here in this virtual room, we share very many of the questions that drive your research, right? The ethical underpinnings, the procedure, the link into the policy community, all those things are very close to our hearts as well as researchers. Leah, thank you very much also for joining us. It's great that you could be with us, although being on maternity leave, it's great to hear also from you. And, we will continue this discussion, and thank you so much, Sarah, for taking the time. I know, you just landed here, you try to find your footing, but it's great to have, that we have you in our community here at UVic again and can draw on the expertise.